Sarah Mitchell never imagined that the most beautiful day of her life would nearly become a tragedy, and she certainly never expected that her salvation would come from the weathered hands of a homeless man named Thomas, who had been quietly watching from the church steps. What she didn't know was that Thomas wasn't just any drifter seeking shelter. He was a former fire chief who had lost everything in a blaze that claimed his family 5 years ago. And today, his past would collide with her present in the most extraordinary way possible. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. The morning sun painted the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Cathedral in brilliant hues of gold and crimson, casting rainbow fragments across the marble floor, where 27-year-old Sarah Mitchell would soon walk down the aisle to marry the love of her life. In the bridal suite above, Sarah stood before an ornate mirror framed in gilded roses, her mother and 3 bridesmaids fluttering around her like butterflies attending to their queen. The Vera Wang gown, a masterpiece of ivory silk and French lace that had cost more than most people earned in a year, hugged her slender frame perfectly, its cathedral train spreading behind her like spilled moonlight. Sarah's father, Robert Harrison, had spared no expense for his only daughter's wedding, transforming the historic cathedral into a fairy tale setting with white orchids, cascading pearl garlands, and enough candles to illuminate a small city. Outside, luxury cars deposited guests in designer gowns and tailored suits, their jewelry catching the morning light as they climbed the stone steps, chattering excitedly about the social event of the season. But on those same stone steps, partially hidden in the shadow of an ancient pillar, sat a figure that seemed to belong to an entirely different world. Thomas Bennett, though none of the passing guests knew his name, watched the parade of wealth with eyes that held neither envy nor resentment, but rather a quiet sadness that spoke of dreams long buried. His clothes, layers of mismatched fabric held together by hope and necessity, told the story of countless nights spent seeking shelter wherever he could find it. His graying beard was neatly trimmed with a broken pocket knife, his only concession to the grandeur surrounding him, and his weathered hands clutched a paper cup that had long since grown cold. The contrast was stark yet somehow beautiful in its own way. This man who possessed nothing but dignity watching over a celebration that represented everything he had lost, his gentle presence a reminder that grace could be found in the most unexpected places, though no one inside the cathedral yet understood the profound role he was destined to play in their perfect day. The cathedral bells chimed 11 times, their bronze voices carrying across the city as Father Michael O'Brien, resplendent in his ceremonial white vestments, took his place at the altar beneath a canopy of white roses and baby's breath. Thomas shifted slightly on the cold stone steps, his view through the massive oak doors offering him a perfect glimpse into a world that seemed to exist behind glass, beautiful but untouchable. The processional music began, a string quartet filling the sacred space with Pachelbel's canon, and Thomas watched as the bridesmaids glided down the aisle in their flowing champagne-colored gowns, each one carrying a bouquet of white peonies tied with silk ribbons. Michael Anderson, the groom, stood tall and proud at the altar in his custom-tailored black tuxedo, his face radiant with anticipation as he adjusted his platinum cufflinks nervously. Thomas observed the young man's joy with a bittersweet smile, remembering his own wedding day 30 years ago when he had worn his dress uniform and felt like the luckiest man alive. The guests rose as one when the bridal march began, 200 faces turning toward the back of the cathedral with expressions of pure delight, their collective intake of breath audible even from Thomas's distant perch. As Sarah appeared in the doorway on her father's arm, a vision of ethereal beauty against the backdrop of flickering candlelight, Thomas unconsciously glanced down at his left wrist where a battered Timex watch, its face cracked and band held together with electrical tape, still kept perfect time after 28 years of faithful service. The watch had been a gift from the fire department when he graduated from the academy, engraved with Chief Thomas Bennett and the station's motto, Courage, Honor, Service, though the words were now barely visible beneath layers of grime and wear. He had never been able to bring himself to remove it, this last tangible link to the man he used to be, the man who had saved lives and commanded respect, the man who had believed that being brave meant something. Inside the cathedral, Father O'Brien's voice rang out warm and welcoming, asking the congregation to join in celebrating the union of two souls, while Thomas sat in his solitude, bearing witness to their happiness like a guardian angel they would never notice. The unity candle ceremony had always been Sarah's favorite part of any wedding she had ever attended, and now, as she and Michael approached the altar where 3 tall white candles waited in their ornate silver holders, she felt her heart swell with the symbolic beauty of 2 flames becoming one. Father O'Brien smiled warmly as he explained the meaning to the gathered congregation, his voice carrying the weight of countless ceremonies performed in this very spot. While Sarah's train whispered against the marble floor behind her, the intricate lacework catching the light from dozens of votive candles that lined the altar steps like tiny stars. Michael's hand was steady as he lifted his taper candle, the flame dancing gently in the still air. And Sarah reached for hers with fingers that trembled slightly from the overwhelming emotion of the moment, her diamond engagement ring catching the candlelight and sending sparkles across the cathedral walls. They moved together toward the center unity candle, a thick pillar of pure white wax that would symbolize their joined lives. But as Sarah leaned forward, her voluminous train shifted behind her, the delicate French lace and layers of silk tulle cascading closer to the row of memorial candles that flickered in honor of deceased family members. The congregation held its collective breath in the sacred silence, 200 guests witnessing this most intimate moment, when suddenly the unthinkable happened with the swiftness of a nightmare. The hem of Sarah's magnificent gown brushed against a memorial candle, and within seconds, the delicate fabric caught fire, the flames racing up the expensive lace with terrifying speed, as if the dress had been soaked in gasoline. Sarah's scream pierced the cathedral silence, a sound of pure terror that echoed off the vaulted ceiling, and chaos erupted as guests leaped to their feet, women shrieking in horror, men shouting instructions that no one could hear over the pandemonium. Michael stood frozen, his face drained of all color. The unity candle still clutched in his trembling hand as he watched his bride become engulfed in flames, his mind unable to process the transformation from perfect joy to absolute horror. Outside on the stone steps, Thomas heard the screaming before he saw the orange glow flickering through the stained glass windows, and every instinct honed by 25 years of fighting fires suddenly roared to life in his weathered body. Without a moment's hesitation, Thomas dropped his paper cup and launched himself up the cathedral steps, his body moving with a precision and purpose that seemed to defy his worn appearance, 25 years of training and instinct overriding the 5 years of defeat that had brought him to these stone steps. The homeless man who had been invisible to every guest entering the church suddenly transformed into something else entirely, his stride lengthening into the confident gait of a man who had run into burning buildings when others ran out, his weathered hands already reaching for the tattered wool coat that served as both his blanket and his only protection against the elements. As he burst through the cathedral doors, his eyes swept the scene with the systematic efficiency of a seasoned fire chief, taking in the flame pattern, the wind direction from the open doors, the proximity of other combustible materials, and most importantly, the victim's condition in the span of 3 heartbeats. The panicking crowd barely registered his presence at first, their attention focused on the horrifying sight of Sarah engulfed in flames. But Thomas moved through them like water flowing around stones, his voice cutting through the chaos with an authority that had once commanded entire fire stations. "Move back. Give her space. Someone call 911, he barked, his words sharp and clear, carrying the unmistakable tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed in crisis situations, though the guests were too shocked to wonder how this ragged stranger had suddenly taken charge of their catastrophe. Father O'Brien stepped aside instinctively, recognizing the voice of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. While Michael remained frozen in his tuxedo, still clutching the unity candle as if it were an anchor in a storm he could not comprehend. The wedding photographer, who had been capturing every precious moment, now found his lens following this unexpected figure who moved with such purposeful determination, This man, whose very presence seemed to shift the energy in the room from helpless panic to focused action. Thomas's cracked firefighter's watch caught a glint of light as he raised his arms, preparing to do what he had done countless times before. Though never had the stakes felt quite so personal, never had the distance between his past and present collapsed so completely in a single burning moment. Thomas reached Sarah in 4 swift strides, his movements fluid and deliberate as he swept his heavy wool coat from his shoulders, the garment that had been his shelter through countless freezing nights, now becoming the instrument of salvation, as he assessed the flame pattern climbing her dress with the trained eye of a man who had studied fire behavior for decades. "Sarah, stop moving, look at me. I need you to stay completely still," he commanded, his voice steady and reassuring despite the urgency of the situation. And something in his tone cut through her panic, causing her to freeze mid-scream as flames licked at the intricate beadwork of her bodice. With practiced precision, Thomas wrapped his coat around the lower portion of her dress, smothering the flames with firm, controlled movements. Working from bottom to top to prevent the fire from spreading upward, his hands moving with the muscle memory of countless emergency responses as he beat down each tongue of flame methodically. "Michael, help me lay her down gently. Support her head," Thomas ordered, snapping the frozen groom out of his paralysis, and suddenly the young man found himself following the instructions of this stranger, whose authority seemed to fill the entire cathedral despite his humble appearance. The thick wool of Thomas's coat, heavy with years of wear and weather, proved perfect for containing the flames, absorbing the heat and cutting off the oxygen that fed the fire with an efficiency that spoke to both fortune and experience. "Everyone step back. Give us room to work, Father O'Brien. Please clear a path to the side door," Thomas continued, his voice carrying across the vaulted space as guests who moments before had seen only a homeless man now witnessed the emergence of someone entirely different, someone whose very presence transformed chaos into coordinated action. Within 90 seconds, the flames were completely extinguished, wisps of smoke rising from the charred remnants of what had been the most beautiful dress in the city, while Sarah lay safe on the marble floor, her face pale but her breathing steady, surrounded by the scorched wool that had once kept a forgotten man warm through the longest nights of his life. The cathedral fell silent except for the sound of Sarah's quiet sobbing and the distant wail of approaching sirens. 200 guests staring in stunned amazement at the man kneeling beside their bride, this guardian angel who had appeared from nowhere to save the day. Sarah lay on the cool marble floor, her wedding dress now a patchwork of charred silk and soot-stained lace, but her green eyes were clear and focused as she looked up at the weathered face of the man who had just saved her life, her chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of someone who had narrowly escaped disaster but was very much alive. Thomas knelt beside her, his own coat ruined and smoking, but his gentle hands continued to check for any remaining embers with the thoroughness of a professional, his touch careful and respectful as he ensured that every last spark had been extinguished from the expensive fabric that now resembled battle-worn armor more than bridal finery. The cathedral had fallen into an almost reverent silence, broken only by the soft whispers of guests who struggled to process what they had just witnessed, their eyes fixed not on the bride they had come to celebrate, but on the homeless man whose swift actions had prevented an unthinkable tragedy from unfolding before their very eyes. Michael dropped to his knees beside his wife, his tuxedo forgotten as he reached for Sarah's hand, tears streaming down his face as the full weight of what could have been lost crashed over him like a tidal wave, his voice breaking as he tried to find words adequate to express gratitude for a gift beyond measure. "Sir, I don't know who you are, but you saved her life. You saved everything," Michael whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at Thomas with the kind of reverence usually reserved for saints and miracles. Though Thomas simply nodded quietly and began to rise, clearly uncomfortable with the attention that was now focused entirely on him. The wedding guests, who had arrived dressed in their finest clothes to witness a celebration, now found themselves witnesses to something far more profound, their designer gowns and expensive suits seeming suddenly trivial in the presence of true heroism that wore the humble clothes of a man society had forgotten. Sarah reached up and grasped Thomas's weathered hand before he could stand completely, her voice soft but determined. as she spoke the words that would echo through the cathedral and change everything. "Please don't leave." "Not yet. I need to know your name. I need to thank you properly for giving me back my life." Robert Harrison had built his fortune by reading people, by understanding their motivations and assessing their true worth within moments of meeting them. But as he approached the man who had just saved his daughter's life, he found himself facing a puzzle that challenged every assumption he had ever made about success, dignity, and the measure of a human being. The distinguished businessman, whose hand-tailored Armani suit cost more than most people spent on their cars, moved through the crowd of stunned wedding guests. With the purposeful stride that had carried him through countless boardroom negotiations. But now his usual confidence was tempered by something he rarely experienced: genuine humility in the face of pure heroism. Robert's steel-gray eyes, which had intimidated corporate rivals and sealed multi-million-dollar deals, softened as they took in the sight of Thomas kneeling beside Sarah. This stranger, whose tattered clothing and weathered appearance spoke of hardships that Robert could barely imagine, yet whose actions had displayed a courage and selflessness that put every successful man in the cathedral to shame. "Sir, my name is Robert Harrison, and you have just saved the most precious thing in my world," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to commanding attention, though now it was tinged with an emotion that his business associates would have found unrecognizable: the raw vulnerability of a father who had nearly lost his child. Thomas looked up at the imposing figure approaching him, recognizing immediately the bearing of wealth and power, the confident posture of someone who had never wanted for anything, yet seeing in Robert's eyes something that transcended social barriers: the universal love of a parent faced with their worst nightmare. The expensive cologne and perfectly groomed appearance that marked Robert as a member of the city's elite seemed to fade into irrelevance as he extended his hand toward Thomas, a gesture that bridged two entirely different worlds in a moment of shared humanity. Around them, the wedding guests watched this unlikely encounter with fascination, witnessing their host, one of the most influential men in the city, treating this homeless stranger with a deference that spoke volumes about the profound impact of Thomas's heroic actions, though none of them yet understood the deeper mystery of who this guardian angel truly was. Thomas gently released Sarah's hand and began to back away from the altar, his instinct to disappear into the shadows as quietly as he had emerged, the weight of 200 curious stares making him acutely aware of his shabby appearance and the vast gulf between his current circumstances and the elegant world he had just stepped into uninvited. "I should go. The paramedics will be here soon. You're safe now. That's all that matters," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the murmur of conversations that had begun to ripple through the crowd. But Sarah struggled to sit up despite Michael's gentle protests, her eyes never leaving Thomas's face as she recognized something in his demeanor that went far deeper than simple modesty. "No. Please. You can't just leave like this, not after what you've done," Sarah insisted, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, the authority of a woman who had been raised to get what she wanted, now directed toward keeping her savior from vanishing like some sort of mysterious apparition. The wedding guests exchanged confused glances as they watched this homeless man's obvious discomfort with their gratitude. His shoulders hunched, as if he were trying to make himself smaller, invisible, unworthy of the attention that rightfully belonged to him, though none of them could understand why someone who had just performed such a heroic act would seem almost ashamed to accept their praise. Father O'Brien approached Thomas with the gentle wisdom of a man who had counseled countless souls through their darkest hours. Noticing details that others missed, the precise way Thomas had handled the emergency, the terminology he had used, the unmistakable bearing of someone who had once held authority and commanded respect in situations exactly like this one. "Son, you handled that situation like a professional, like someone who's seen fire before, who's fought it before," the priest said quietly, his words causing Thomas to flinch almost imperceptibly, a reaction that spoke of memories too painful to touch, of a past that he had tried desperately to bury beneath years of wandering and self-imposed exile. As the sound of sirens grew louder outside the cathedral, Thomas's weathered hand unconsciously moved to his wrist, touching the cracked face of his old fire department watch. a gesture so subtle that only the most observant would notice, but one that carried the weight of a story yet to be told. Eleanor Anderson had lived in this city for 63 years, had raised 3 children here, had attended countless community events and charity galas, and had developed the kind of comprehensive social memory that made her the unofficial historian of everyone who mattered in their close-knit upper-class circles. So when she watched this mysterious homeless man tend to Sarah with such professional competence, something deep in her mind began to stir, a recognition that felt like trying to remember a half-forgotten song. Michael's mother moved closer to the small group gathered around the bride, her sharp blue eyes studying Thomas's profile with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that felt tantalizingly familiar, noting the strong jawline beneath his graying beard, the confident way he held his shoulders despite his humble circumstances, the precise manner in which he had taken charge of the emergency with an authority that seemed to come from years of practice rather than natural instinct. As Thomas finally stood and began to move away from Sarah, his ruined coat shifted on his shoulders, and a small metallic object that had been tucked into an inner pocket fell to the marble floor with a sharp ping that echoed through the cathedral's sudden silence, landing at Eleanor's feet like a key to a mystery she had been trying to unlock. She bent down and picked up the tarnished brass badge, its surface worn smooth by years of handling, and her breath caught in her throat as she read the engraved words that had once been crisp and proud but were now barely legible beneath layers of grime and wear. Chief Thomas Bennett, Station 19, City Fire Department. The blood drained from Eleanor's face as memories came flooding back. Images from newspaper headlines 5 years ago, the tragic story of the fire chief who had lost his family while he was saving others. The hero who had simply disappeared from public life after the funerals, leaving behind a legacy of service and a community that had wondered what became of their fallen leader. "Thomas Bennett," she whispered, her voice carrying across the cathedral with the weight of recognition and disbelief, causing Thomas to freeze mid-step as his worst fear materialized, his carefully constructed anonymity shattered by a simple piece of metal that he had never been able to throw away, the last tangible proof of the man he used to be before tragedy stripped away everything that had defined him. 5 years earlier, Thomas Bennett had been a different man entirely, his uniform pressed and proud, his badge gleaming with the respect of a community that looked up to him as their guardian against the flames that could consume everything they held dear, his strong hands steady and sure as he commanded Station 19, with the kind of quiet authority that came from 15 years of running into burning buildings when everyone else ran out. Chief Bennett's corner office overlooked the bay where fire trucks sat polished and ready, their red paint gleaming under fluorescent lights, while maps and emergency protocols covered his walls alongside photos of successful rescues and commendations from grateful families whose lives his team had saved. But the centerpiece of his desk was a simple silver frame containing a picture of the 2 people who made every dangerous day worthwhile. Linda Bennett had been his college sweetheart, a kindergarten teacher with warm brown eyes and a laugh that could light up their entire house. Her gentle nature, the perfect complement to his intensity, her ability to find joy in small moments, teaching him that heroism at work meant nothing without love at home. And their daughter, Emma, 8 years old, with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn determination, was the kind of child who collected stray animals and believed that her daddy could fix anything that was broken in the world. Their modest 2-story home on Maple Street had been filled with the sounds of family life. Emma's piano practice echoing through rooms where Linda graded papers at the kitchen table while Thomas helped with homework, their routine as comfortable and reliable as the sunrise, weekend barbecues in their backyard, where Thomas taught Emma how to properly tend a safe fire in their fire pit, while Linda worried playfully about having 2 pyromaniacs in the family. Thomas had been known throughout the department as a leader who never asked his men to take risks he wouldn't take himself, a chief who remembered every firefighter's birthday and family situation, whose door was always open and whose word was his bond, respected not just for his tactical brilliance in fighting fires, but for his genuine care for both his team and the community they served, never knowing that his dedication to saving others would one day cost him everything he treasured most, never imagining that the very job that defined him would become the source of his deepest shame and regret. The call had come in at 7:32 on a Tuesday evening in March, an emergency dispatch about a warehouse fire on the industrial side of town, where chemicals and old timber created the kind of inferno that required every available unit and the personal attention of the fire chief. So Thomas had kissed Linda goodbye as she helped Emma with her science project at the kitchen table, promising to be home by 10 o'clock for their daughter's bedtime story, never imagining that this routine goodbye would be their last. The warehouse fire had been a monster, flames shooting 50 feet into the night sky as Thomas coordinated 6 engine companies and 2 ladder trucks. The old building's contents creating toxic smoke that required careful strategy and precise execution, while 3 workers remained trapped on the second floor, their lives depending on Thomas's ability to direct his teams through a maze of burning corridors and collapsing supports. For 4 hours, Thomas had been consumed by the battle against the flames, his radio crackling with updates and requests for orders, his mind calculating wind patterns and water pressure and evacuation routes with the laser focus that had made him the youngest chief in the department's history. Completely unaware that 15 miles away, a faulty electrical outlet in his own basement had sparked a fire that was quietly consuming the foundation of his entire world. The cruel irony would haunt him forever, that while he was orchestrating the successful rescue of 3 strangers, saving their lives with the expertise and dedication that defined his career, his own house was filling with smoke, the flames creeping up the stairs toward the bedrooms where Linda was helping Emma finish her homework, both of them trusting that the smoke detectors Thomas had personally installed and tested would give them enough warning to escape safely. By the time a neighbor called 911 and the responding units realized they were heading to the fire chief's own address, the flames had already claimed the 2 people who meant more to Thomas than all the strangers he had ever saved. Their lives extinguished not by any failure of the fire department's response, but by the simple, devastating fact that Thomas Bennett, the man who could save anyone from anything, had not been home when his own family needed him most, creating a wound that would never heal, and a guilt that would destroy everything he had once believed about himself. The funeral had been attended by hundreds of people, fellow firefighters and community members who had come to pay their respects to Linda and Emma Bennett. But Thomas had stood at the graveside like a ghost of himself, his dress uniform hanging loose on a frame that had already begun to waste away from sleepless nights and an inability to eat anything without tasting ash and regret. In the weeks that followed, Thomas found himself unable to enter a burning building without seeing Linda's face in the flames, unable to give orders without hearing Emma's laughter echoing through the smoke, his hands shaking uncontrollably whenever the alarm bells rang, his once steady voice cracking over the radio as panic attacks seized him in the middle of emergency calls. The department had been patient at first, offering counseling and time off, understanding that their beloved chief was struggling with grief that went beyond normal human endurance. But when Thomas froze during a house fire and nearly got 2 of his men killed because he couldn't think clearly enough to coordinate the rescue, everyone realized that the man who had once been their rock had become a danger to himself and others. The forced retirement came with full benefits and heartfelt recommendations, but Thomas saw it as the final confirmation of his worthlessness, the official acknowledgement that he had failed not just his family, but every person who had ever trusted him to keep them safe, and he began drinking to quiet the voices in his head that whispered accusations with every breath he took. Within 6 months, the house on Maple Street had been sold to pay debts he could no longer manage, the proceeds disappearing into a haze of alcohol and prescription medications that promised relief but delivered only deeper despair. And Thomas found himself living in cheap motels and eventually on the streets, pushing away every friend and colleague who tried to help him because he believed with absolute certainty that anyone who got close to him would eventually be destroyed by his curse. The transition from respected fire chief to homeless wanderer had been swift and brutal, his descent accelerated by a self-loathing so profound that he refused charity, declined job offers, and actively sought the kind of invisibility that would protect the world from the poison he was convinced he carried. Spending 5 years moving from city to city like a ghost haunting his own life, until fate brought him to these cathedral steps. Eleanor's voice carried across the cathedral like a prayer answered, and Thomas turned slowly to face her. his weathered features crumbling as he saw the recognition in her eyes, the dawning understanding that connected his heroic past to his broken present, and he knew with devastating certainty that his carefully constructed anonymity was about to be stripped away completely. Thomas Bennett, oh my dear God, Linda's Thomas, Emma's daddy, Eleanor whispered, her perfectly manicured hand pressed to her chest as tears began to stream down her cheeks, her voice breaking with the weight of memories that suddenly made perfect sense, the puzzle pieces of tragedy and heroism finally clicking into place. The wealthy matron who had spent decades hosting charity luncheons and society events now stood transfixed by the sight of a man she had known in his glory days, when he had been the pride of the fire department and Linda had brought him to school fundraisers where Eleanor had served on the board. Their friendship built around their shared love for children and community service. Linda used to talk about you constantly. How proud she was of her hero husband. How Emma adored her brave daddy who saved people for a living. Eleanor continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the cathedral where guests stood in stunned silence, beginning to understand that they were witnessing something far more profound than a simple rescue, a story of loss and redemption that had been 5 years in the making. Thomas's face flushed with shame as he saw himself through Eleanor's eyes. The contrast between the respected chief she had once known and the broken man he had become, of his current state a mockery of everything Linda had loved about him, everything Emma had believed him to be, and he wanted nothing more than to disappear into the earth beneath the marble floor. She would have been so proud of what you just did, Eleanor said softly, stepping closer despite his obvious desire to flee, her words hitting him like physical blows, because they reminded him of a time when he had been worthy of pride, when his actions had brought honor instead of shame. When the badge now lying on the cathedral floor had meant something more than a relic of his spectacular failure as both a firefighter and a man. Sarah struggled to her feet despite Michael's gentle protests, her charred wedding dress rustling like autumn leaves as she steadied herself against her new husband's arm, her voice gaining strength with each word as she looked directly at Thomas, refusing to let him retreat into the shadows where he had hidden for 5 years of self-imposed exile. Thomas Bennett, I don't care what happened in your past. I don't care about the pain you've been carrying or the shame you think you deserve. Because today, right now, you are the reason I'm alive to marry the man I love. You are the reason my father still has a daughter and my future children will have a mother, Sarah declared, her voice ringing through the cathedral with the clarity of absolute truth. Each word carefully chosen and delivered with the kind of conviction that could move mountains. The wedding guests, who had come expecting to witness vows of love and commitment, now found themselves part of something far more profound, a moment of raw human connection that transcended social boundaries and touched the very essence of what it meant to be alive, their expensive clothing and jewelry suddenly meaningless in the face of genuine heroism and authentic gratitude. 5 years ago, you couldn't save the people you loved most, but today you saved me, and maybe that's exactly what God intended. Maybe that's why you were sitting on those steps at the exact moment when I needed a guardian angel, Sarah continued, tears streaming down her soot-stained cheeks as she spoke words that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, from a place of intuitive understanding about purpose and redemption that surprised even her. Thomas stood frozen, his hands trembling as he listened to this young woman speak about divine purpose and second chances, concepts he had long since abandoned as luxuries for people who hadn't failed as completely as he had, but something in Sarah's absolute certainty began to crack the shell of self-hatred he had built around his heart. Around them, 200 wedding guests wiped away tears as they witnessed not just gratitude, but a kind of grace in action. The recognition that heroism could emerge from the most unexpected places, that salvation sometimes came dressed in rags and carrying the wounds of past failures, and that true nobility had nothing to do with wealth or status, but everything to do with the willingness to risk oneself for a stranger, proving that angels could be found sitting on church steps if you knew how to look for them. Robert Harrison had built an empire worth $300 million, had his name on hospital wings and university buildings, and had been featured on magazine covers as one of the city's most influential power brokers. But as he watched his daughter speak about divine purpose and guardian angels to this broken man who had saved her life, he felt the hollowness that had been growing in his chest for years suddenly become a chasm that all his success could never fill. The businessman who had acquired companies like chess pieces and negotiated deals that moved markets stepped forward with the slow deliberation of a man who had just realized that everything he thought mattered was nothing more than elaborate decoration around an empty life. His perfectly tailored suit and platinum watch suddenly feeling like costumes he had worn to play a role that brought him no real satisfaction. "Mr. Bennett, my daughter is right about divine purpose, but I think it works both ways," Robert said, his voice carrying the weight of a revelation that was reshaping his understanding of wealth and worth in real time. His steel-gray eyes meeting Thomas's with an intensity that spoke of recognition between two men who had lost their way for very different reasons. Robert had spent decades accumulating money and influence because society had taught him that these were the measures of a man's value. But standing in this cathedral, surrounded by the aftermath of real heroism, he finally understood that all his achievements had been attempts to fill a void that could only be satisfied by genuine purpose and by the kind of meaning that came from actually mattering in someone else's life, rather than simply dominating balance sheets and boardrooms. "I've been searching for something real for longer than I care to admit, something that would make all this wealth mean something beyond numbers in a bank account. And I think you need what I can offer just as much as I need what you represent," Robert continued, his words surprising even himself with their honesty. The successful facade he had maintained for so long cracking under the weight of authentic emotion. Thomas looked at this imposing figure who commanded respect in every room he entered, this man who possessed everything that society valued, and saw something unexpected in Robert's eyes, a hunger that had nothing to do with money or power, but everything to do with the basic human need to matter and to contribute something meaningful to the world beyond the accumulation of material success that had left him spiritually bankrupt despite his financial abundance. Robert reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a business card. But instead of handing it to Thomas, he held it for a moment as he spoke, his voice gaining the kind of authoritative confidence that had closed billion-dollar deals, though now it was tempered with a vulnerability that his business associates had never seen. "I own Harrison Construction and Development. We build hospitals, schools, apartment complexes, projects that matter to communities. And I need someone to head up our safety division, someone who understands fire prevention and emergency protocols better than anyone else in this city. Someone whose expertise could save hundreds of lives over the coming years," Robert said, his offer carrying the weight of genuine respect rather than charity. Recognizing that Thomas needed purpose more than pity, needed to feel useful rather than simply rescued, Thomas shook his head immediately, backing away from the extended card as if it were contaminated with his own failure, his voice rough with self-recrimination as he struggled to articulate why Robert's generosity was wasted on someone like him. "Mr. Harrison, you don't understand. I failed. I lost my family because I wasn't there when they needed me. I froze during emergencies. I put other firefighters at risk. I'm not the man you think I am. I'm not the man I used to be," Thomas said, each word a confession that tore at his throat. The litany of his failures spilling out like poison he had been carrying for 5 years. Robert stepped closer, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor as he refused to be deterred by Thomas's self-condemnation, his businessman's instincts recognizing the difference between genuine incapacity and wounded pride, between actual failure and the kind of trauma that could be healed with time and purpose. "The man I think you are just saved my daughter's life using skills and courage that haven't disappeared just because you've been through hell, and the job comes with a house, health insurance, a chance to start over. Not because I pity you, but because I need what you have to offer, because those skills that saved Sarah could save countless others if you'll let them," Robert pressed, his voice growing more insistent as he saw Thomas continue to resist. Understanding that sometimes salvation required persistence, and that broken people needed to be convinced of their own worth before they could accept help. The wedding guests watched this extraordinary negotiation unfold, witnessing a moment when charity transformed into opportunity, when redemption was offered not as a gift but as a partnership between two men who needed each other more than either fully understood. Sarah looked down at her wedding dress, the magnificent Vera Wang creation that had cost more than most people's cars, but was now a patchwork of charred silk and smoke-stained lace. The cathedral train that had once flowed behind her like spilled moonlight, now bearing the scars of flame and the stains of Thomas's sacrificial coat. And instead of mourning its destruction, she felt her heart swell with a fierce pride that surprised everyone around her. "This dress is perfect," Sarah announced, her voice ringing through the cathedral with absolute conviction as she ran her fingers along the damaged fabric, tracing the burn marks as if they were precious embroidery. Each char marked a testament to the moment when a stranger's courage had saved her life and changed everything for everyone present. The wedding guests, who had gasped in horror when the flames first caught the expensive fabric, now began to understand what Sarah meant as they watched her transform tragedy into triumph, her ruined gown becoming something far more valuable than any designer creation could ever be. A tangible reminder that true beauty came not from perfection, but from the stories that shaped us and the love that saved us. This dress brought Thomas into our lives. It brought all of us together in a way that no perfect ceremony ever could, and I'm going to treasure every burned thread, because they represent the moment when we learned what real heroism looks like, Sarah continued, her words inspiring something extraordinary among the 200 guests who had come to witness a wedding, but had instead become part of something much more profound. Eleanor stepped forward first, her voice strong despite her tears as she addressed the crowd. "I knew Linda Bennett, and she would want us to take care of her husband. She would want him to know that he still has family in this city, that he still has people who believe in him." Robert nodded emphatically, his business instincts now aligned with his heart as he surveyed the faces around him, recognizing an opportunity to create something meaningful from this moment of grace. Every person in this cathedral has been touched by what happened here today, and I think we all know that Thomas shouldn't face tomorrow alone. We have the resources and the connections to help him rebuild not just his life, but his sense of purpose, Robert declared. And suddenly the cathedral was filled with voices, offering help, jobs, housing, support. A community that had been strangers an hour ago, now united around the simple recognition that saving Thomas was really about saving themselves. Thomas spent 3 sleepless nights walking the city streets after the wedding, Robert's business card growing soft and worn in his pocket as he wrestled with demons that had controlled his life for 5 years, the voices in his head alternating between Linda's gentle encouragement and his own harsh condemnation, and between the memory of Emma's laughter and the crushing weight of his failures as a husband and father who had put strangers before his own family. On Thursday evening, he was sitting on a park bench near the river, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him of the flames that had taken everything he loved when Sarah and Michael found him, the newlyweds still glowing with happiness, but now carrying something deeper, a gravity that spoke of lives forever changed by their encounter with grace in its most unexpected form. Sarah sat beside him without invitation, her simple blue dress a stark contrast to the ruined wedding gown that had brought them together, while Michael stood nearby, both of them radiating the kind of peace that comes from understanding that their love story had been saved by something larger than themselves, something that had given their marriage a foundation built on genuine gratitude rather than mere romance. "Thomas, we've been thinking about what happened, about what it means, and we realize that you didn't just save my life, you saved our understanding of what love really looks like," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had faced death and emerged with a clearer vision of what truly mattered in life. Michael nodded, his hand finding Sarah's shoulder as he spoke with the sincerity of a man who had watched his world nearly disappear in flames. "Before that day, I thought love was about the perfect wedding, the perfect dress, the perfect moment. But you showed us that real love is about being willing to sacrifice everything for someone you've never met, about seeing past appearances to the human being who needs help." Thomas felt something crack inside his chest as he listened to their words, a fissure in the wall of shame he had built around his heart, because for the first time in 5 years, someone was telling him that his actions had created something beautiful rather than destroying it, that his presence had been a blessing rather than a curse, that maybe, just maybe, Linda and Emma would be proud of the man he had become in that crucial moment when everything hung in the balance. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out Robert's business card, now soft with handling and creased from 3 days of indecision, and as he looked at Sarah and Michael's faces, filled with such genuine care and hope, he felt the last of his resistance crumble like a dam, finally giving way to the flood of possibility that had been building behind it. 6 months later, Thomas Bennett stood in the lobby of Harrison Construction wearing a crisp white shirt and navy blazer, his newly trimmed beard framing a face that had regained the confident bearing of a man with purpose, his title of Fire Safety Coordinator gleaming on the nameplate of an office that overlooked the city he was helping to protect once again. The transformation had been gradual but profound, beginning with the small apartment Robert had provided and continuing through the careful rebuilding of Thomas's professional confidence as he developed safety protocols for construction sites, reviewed building plans for fire code compliance, and trained crews in emergency procedures with the expertise that had never truly left him despite 5 years of self-imposed exile. Sarah and Michael had become more than grateful friends. They had become the family Thomas never expected to find again, visiting him every Sunday for dinner, where they shared stories and laughter that slowly filled the empty spaces in his heart without trying to replace the love he still carried for Linda and Emma. The construction workers who initially viewed him with suspicion had grown to respect his knowledge and appreciate his quiet dedication to their safety, while the Cathedral community had embraced him as living proof that redemption was possible, that second chances could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, that angels sometimes needed saving just as much as they needed to save others. On his desk, beside the new safety manuals and project files, Thomas kept 2 photographs in simple frames. One of Linda and Emma that reminded him of love that would never die, and one of Sarah in her charred wedding dress, a symbol of the moment when his life had found meaning again, when he had learned that sometimes the greatest gift a broken person could give the world was the willingness to try once more. To step forward when others stepped back, to prove that heroes could rise from the ashes of their own failures if they were brave enough to believe in tomorrow. Thomas Bennett stood at the altar of St. Mark's Chapel exactly 1 year after Sarah's wedding, but this time he wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit his now healthy frame, his silver hair neatly combed, and his weathered hands steady as he held the ceremonial lighter that would help another young couple begin their journey together, his presence here not as an uninvited observer, but as an honored guest who had earned his place through courage, redemption, and the patient rebuilding of a life worth living. The bride and groom, colleagues from Harrison Construction whose safety protocols Thomas had personally designed, had specifically requested that he participate in their unity candle ceremony. Understanding that his story had become legendary throughout the company, a testament to the power of second chances and the possibility of finding light even in the darkest corners of human experience. As Thomas approached the 3 white candles arranged on the altar, he felt Linda and Emma's presence not as ghosts haunting his failures, but as loving spirits celebrating his victory, their memory no longer a source of crushing guilt, but a wellspring of strength that reminded him that love never truly dies. It simply transforms into the courage to love again, to serve again, to matter again in ways both small and profound. The young couple looked at him with the kind of reverence that Thomas had once thought he would never deserve again, their faces glowing with the understanding that they were being blessed by someone who had walked through fire, both literal and metaphorical, and emerged with wisdom that could only be earned through suffering and grace. As Thomas lit the taper candles that the bride and groom would use to ignite their unity flame, he thought of the night 5 years ago, when fire had taken everything he cherished, and then of the moment 6 months ago, when fire had given him the chance to save another family, proving that the same element that could destroy could also purify, could burn away everything false, and leave behind only what was essential and true. The flame caught and danced in the chapel's gentle air, casting warm light across the faces of 50 guests who witnessed not just a wedding ceremony, but a living reminder that heroes could be reborn from the ashes of their own tragedies, that the human spirit was more resilient than anyone could imagine, and that sometimes the greatest gift we could give the world was simply the willingness to keep trying, to keep believing, to keep lighting candles in the darkness until the whole world glowed with hope. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us to look beyond the surface, to see past the worn clothes and weathered faces, to the hearts that beat with the same hopes and fears that drive us all, because heroes don't always wear uniforms or live in mansions or carry themselves with the confidence we expect from those we depend on to save us. Thomas Bennett's story teaches us that redemption is always possible, that the worst moments of our lives don't have to define us forever, and that sometimes the very skills we think we've lost, the very courage we believe has been extinguished by our failures, can emerge stronger than ever when someone else needs us to be brave. Sarah's wedding day could have ended in tragedy, but instead it became the beginning of a new chapter for everyone involved, proving that miracles often come disguised as coincidences, that guardian angels sometimes sit homeless on church steps, waiting for their moment to shine, and that one person's willingness to act when others freeze can create ripples of transformation that touch dozens of lives in ways both profound and permanent. The next time you pass someone society has forgotten, someone whose circumstances make you uncomfortable or whose appearance suggests they have nothing to offer, remember Thomas Bennett and ask yourself whether you're looking at a person in need of help or a hero waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Because the truth is that courage, compassion, and the capacity for sacrifice exist in the most unexpected places, carried by people who have survived their own fires and emerged with wisdom that can only be earned through pain. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think differently about the people you encounter every day, if it reminded you that second chances are always possible and that heroes walk among us in forms we rarely recognize, then share it with someone who needs to be reminded that hope is never lost, that purpose can always be rediscovered, and that every ending can become a new beginning if we're brave enough to believe in the possibility of grace. Because stories like Thomas's don't just entertain us, they challenge us to become the kind of people who would stop to help, who would offer second chances, who would recognize the divine spark that burns in every human heart, regardless of their circumstances or their past.